The entire airbase laughed the morning. A woman in a plain gray flight suit walked across the flight line, carrying nothing but a clipboard and a visitor badge. She moved without hurrying, without looking at the jets, the way people usually do with awe or nerves or the need to prove something. She just walked, steady and quiet, like she already knew every inch of the tarmac under her boots. The pilots lounging near Hangar 7 watched her pass, and one of them started laughing first. Then another. Captain Cole Mercer leaned against the nose of his 40 Raptor variant and crossed his arms, grinning at the others. "Somebody call the gift shop," he said loud enough for her to hear. "Pretty sure they're missing a cashier." The laughter spread across the flight line like a wave. The woman didn't stop, didn't turn, didn't even slow down. She walked straight to the aircraft they had told her to inspect and began her work. And within 11 minutes, she found the hydraulic fault that 3 senior maintainers had signed off on as cleared. The jet that Mercer was scheduled to fly that afternoon would have lost pitch control at 30,000 feet. She didn't tell him that yet. She wrote it down first. "If you're watching this story for the first time, welcome. Stay with me until the very end, because this one doesn't go where you think it's going. If this reached you, if it moved you, hit like and subscribe so you never miss the next one. And drop a comment below with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled." The name on the temporary base access credential read Evelyn Hart, Civilian Flight Safety Evaluator, Tier 2 clearance. That was what Red Mesa Tactical Air Station had been told. That was what the office of the wing commander had been given, a single-page authorization from the Department of Defense's Aviation Safety Directorate, which nobody at Red Mesa had ever dealt with before, mostly because Red Mesa was a mid-tier installation in the high desert of western Arizona, with a reputation for running lean and cutting corners quietly enough that nobody above them ever noticed. The base had 3 operational squadrons, 47 pilots, and a maintenance staff of 200. It also had a problem with its readiness reports that had begun, depending on how you traced it, somewhere between 18 months and 3 years ago. The problem had grown quietly, the way problems do when the people who notice them are also the people who benefit from pretending they don't. Evelyn had been briefed on the base for 6 days before she arrived. She knew the numbers. She knew the names. She knew which aircraft had been marked as flight-ready without the test lights to support it, and she knew which commanding officer had signed off on the certifications. What the briefing couldn't prepare her for was the specific, casual cruelty of how they would treat her from the moment she stepped out of the transport vehicle. She'd been assigned a workspace in a converted supply room off the maintenance bay, a metal folding table, a single overhead bulb that buzzed, and a chair with one leg slightly shorter than the others. She didn't complain about any of it. She set her bag down, plugged in her laptop, and requested the first 3 aircraft maintenance files through the base's administrative system. The files didn't come. She waited 40 minutes, then walked to the maintenance operations desk herself. The staff sergeant at the desk, a young woman with the look of someone who had been told to be unhelpful, glanced at Evelyn's credentials and then back at her screen. Requests go through the wing administrative office. They process in 48 to 72 hours. "The authorization I came in on designates priority file access," Evelyn said. "Same day. It's in the 3rd paragraph. I'll have to check with my supervisor. I'll wait." The sergeant clearly hadn't expected that answer. She picked up her phone. The call lasted 4 minutes, during which she kept her back half-turned to Evelyn and spoke too quietly to be heard. When she hung up, she said the files would be processed normally, and there was nothing she could do about the timeline. Evelyn thanked her and went back to her supply room. She opened her own reference copies, the ones she'd compiled before she arrived, and started there instead. She was on her 3rd page of cross-referenced inspection logs when she heard someone in the doorway. Chief Warrant Officer Marcus Vale was a big man, broad across the shoulders, with a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same material as the tarmac outside. He wore his rank like it had been earned the hard way, which Evelyn would later learn it absolutely had 14 years in aircraft maintenance, 2 combat deployments, a commendation he never talked about, and a back injury from a loading accident he mentioned only when the weather changed. He stood in the doorway of her supply room, looking at the spread of documents on her table, with an expression she couldn't immediately read. "You're the evaluator," he said. "Yes." "You found something on the 404 this morning." "I flagged a hydraulic actuator issue, yes." The return pressure on the left elevator control was reading. "I know what it was reading." He came into the room without being invited, pulled the spare chair from the corner, turned it backward, and sat down with his forearms resting on the top rail. I'm asking how you found it in 11 minutes when my guys had the bird for 2 days. Evelyn looked at him for a moment. I looked at the right thing first. And what told you where to look? The flight log pattern. That aircraft had 3 consecutive short-duration flights in the last 6 weeks, all under 40 minutes. The kind of flights you run when you're worried about something, but you're not ready to pull the bird from service. Someone knew there was a problem and was managing it instead of fixing it. Marcus was quiet for a moment. His expression hadn't changed, but something behind his eyes shifted slightly. Who told you that? He asked. The numbers did. He stood up slowly, picked up the chair and set it back in the corner. At the door, he paused with one hand on the frame. The wing doesn't like outside evaluators walking around finding things on their own. Just so you know, I appreciate the warning. He looked at her once more, just briefly, and then he was gone. Captain Cole Mercer found her at lunchtime. She was eating a sandwich at the metal table she'd stopped by the dining facility, gotten it to go, and come back to work when he appeared in the doorway with 2 other pilots behind him, both of them wearing the particular expressions that men wear when they expect an audience to laugh. Mercer was the kind of man who had never needed to work very hard at confidence, because confidence had always been given to him freely, by teammates and commanding officers, and the simple physics of being exactly 6 feet tall with a pilot's patch and a record that looked good on paper. He had a face that photographed well and a voice that carried easily, and he used both right now. So you're the one who grounded my jet, he said. I flagged a maintenance concern. The aircraft hasn't been officially grounded yet. That's the wing commander's decision, right? He leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed. You know, I've got 200 hours in that aircraft. I think I'd know if something was wrong with it. 200 hours of flight time wouldn't necessarily reveal an intermittent hydraulic pressure drop in the elevator actuator. It's a ground state issue. So now you're explaining how aircraft work to me. You came here to explain something to me. I'm just participating in the conversation. One of the pilots behind him actually made a sound like he was suppressing a laugh, then covered it quickly. Mercer's expression tightened very slightly. What's your background? He asked. Your authorization says flight safety. It lists your previous position as clinical aviation medicine. Which means what exactly? You're a nurse who got promoted to paperwork? My background is in aviation physiology and structural safety assessment. She picked up her sandwich again. Is there something specific you wanted, Captain? Or was this a social visit? I want to know who gave a medical support staff member access to my aircraft's maintenance records. The Department of Defense, she said. 3rd paragraph of my authorization letter. You're welcome to read it. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, stay out of things you don't understand. And he left. The 2 pilots behind him followed, but the one who'd almost laughed glanced back at her before he turned the corner, and there was something in his face that wasn't mockery, something closer to curiosity. The maintenance records Evelyn had requested through official channels arrived on day 2 hours before the end of the business day, in a format that had clearly been prepared with care. The files were complete on the surface, every inspection logged, every sign-off dated, every certification number present. It was thorough work. The kind of thorough that takes time and attention. The kind of thorough that, if you knew what you were looking for, told its own story. Evelyn pulled up the flight operations logs alongside the maintenance records and began comparing timestamps. It was detailed, slow work, the kind that required good lighting, which her supply room didn't have, and silence, which the maintenance bay next door wasn't providing. She moved to the end of the hallway, where a window let in the last of the afternoon light, and sat on the floor with the documents spread around her and worked through the discrepancies one by one. By 8 o'clock that evening, she had identified 11 aircraft that had been certified as test flight verified during a 6-week window in which weather data for the base showed 0 flyable hours on 4 of the relevant days, and reduced visibility conditions that would have grounded the specific aircraft type on 3 more. 7 certifications with no corresponding fuel usage records. Maintenance sign-offs from a staff sergeant who, according to payroll records she'd cross-referenced, had been on medical leave during 2 of the dates in question. The picture wasn't subtle once you knew where to look. Someone had been certifying aircraft as flight-ready without flying them. The question was how far up the chain of command the knowing went. She was photographing the last page of her notes with her phone when she heard footsteps in the hallway, not the casual footsteps of someone going somewhere else, but the specific rhythm of someone walking toward her and knowing exactly where she was. Major Grant Holloway was the wing's deputy operations officer, which meant he was the second highest ranking person responsible for the readiness program that Evelyn had been examining. He was 51 years old, thin in the face, with the kind of carefully maintained uniform that said he thought about appearances more than most. He had the document Evelyn had submitted that morning, her preliminary findings memo, in his hand, and he was holding it the way people hold things they're angry about. Ms. Hart. He stopped a few feet from her. I think we need to have a conversation about the scope of your evaluation. I'm available now if you'd like. He held up the memo. This is outside what you're authorized to examine. You were brought in for flight safety assessment. Operational certification records are a wing-level administrative function. The certification records directly affect flight safety. If aircraft are being marked as flight verified without the verification flights, that is an administrative interpretation, and it's not yours to make. His voice was flat and careful. I'm going to be very clear with you. Your access to wing administrative files is being reviewed. Starting tomorrow morning, all record requests go through my office, and I'll be determining what's relevant to your stated purpose. My stated purpose is flight safety evaluation. I've found multiple aircraft with safety certifications that can't be supported by operational data. You've found data you don't have the context to interpret.
Major, we're done here, Ms. Hart.
He folded the memo once, precisely, and tucked it under his arm. I'll have the administrative office contact you tomorrow about revised access parameters. I'd encourage you to be cooperative. He left. Evelyn stayed where she was for a moment, on the floor in the hallway with the last of the daylight gone and just the fluorescent hum of the overhead light. Then she picked up her documents, organized them, and went back to her supply room. She made copies of everything she had on her personal encrypted drive before she went to sleep that night. She arrived the next morning to find her access credentials to the base record system had been suspended. There was a note on her table, printed on wing letterhead, citing a security review of her authorization clearance. The note was signed by Holloway and countersigned by a name she recognized from the command structure, Colonel Devens Strake, Wing Commander. The note said the review would take 3 to 5 business days. Evelyn read it twice, then folded it and put it in her bag beside her encrypted drive. She got up and went to look for Chief Vale. She found him in Hangar 4, running a post-flight inspection on an aircraft that had come back in the previous evening. He was crouched near the nose gear, and he didn't look up when she came in, but she had the feeling he already knew she was there. They suspended my records access, she said, I heard. Did you know they were going to do it? He was quiet for a moment, running his hand along the edge of a panel seam. I heard something yesterday afternoon. Didn't know if it was real. He stood up, wiped his hands on a rag. Holloway talked to you last night. What'd he say? That I was outside my scope. That the certification records weren't mine to look at. She paused. I found 11 aircraft with certifications that don't match operational data. 7 with no fuel logs. Sign-offs from a sergeant who was on medical leave. Marcus Vale was very still. He had the expression of a man who had known something was wrong and had been telling himself the shape of it was smaller than it was. That's a lot, he said finally. Yes. And now your access is suspended.
Yes.
He looked at the aircraft, then at the floor, then at her. What are you going to do? Keep working, she said. I have what I copied before they shut it down. I also have the physical inspection authority under my original authorization, which hasn't been revoked yet. They can restrict my file access, but they can't pull me off the flight line without a formal cause of removal order, and that takes longer than 3 to 5 business days. Something moved in his face, something that wasn't quite respect yet, but was in the same territory. You've done this before, he said. It wasn't a question. Evaluated bases a few times, not what I mean. She met his eyes. I know, he went back to his inspection. After a moment, he said, without looking up, there's a 307 scheduled for a test run at 1,400. Pre-flight starts at 1,230. If you want to inspect it independently before the crew gets on it, you'd need to be there at 1,130. I'll be there at 1,100, she said. She was at the aircraft at 1,050, which was how she found the second problem. The 307 was a slightly older airframe, a 2-seat trainer variant, and on the surface its maintenance logs were clean, or at least. The version of the logs she'd been given access to before the suspension had looked clean. But the aircraft itself told a different story, if you knew how to read it. She started with the control surfaces, working through each one methodically, running her hands along joints and seams, checking the feel of resistance against her reference points. On the left aileron, she found something that made her stop, a repair patch on the inner surface, freshly painted, with hardware that didn't match the surrounding spec. The repair had been made. It just hadn't been logged. An unlogged repair on a primary control surface was a serious issue under any circumstances. On an aircraft that was about to carry a pilot on a test flight, it was worse. She was photographing the patch when she heard someone behind her. She turned around expecting Marcus Vale or a member of the maintenance crew. It was Mercer. He was in a flight suit, and he wasn't smiling this time. Behind him were two airmen who had the look of people who had been told to do something they weren't sure about. "You shouldn't be on this aircraft," he said. "My physical inspection authority hasn't been revoked. That's under review. In the meantime, you're on the flight line without a current authorization, and this is restricted." "I found an unlogged repair on the left aileron," she said. "Hardware doesn't match spec. The repair was done after the last maintenance log entry, which means whoever did it either didn't report it or the report was suppressed." Mercer went very still. "You need to step away from the aircraft," he said. "I need someone to pull the aileron control panel and look at the repair more carefully before anyone flies this aircraft. That is not your call." "Then make it yours," she said evenly. "You're a pilot. You know what an unlogged control surface repair means." For 1 second, just one, she saw something flicker in his face. Not doubt exactly, but the shadow of it. The recognition, buried under everything else, that she might not be wrong. Then the moment passed, and his expression closed back over it. "Airman Teague," he said to the man on his left, "escort Ms. Hart to the visitor processing office and hold her credentials there, pending the security review." Captain, the airman started now. Evelyn looked at Mercer one more time. She wasn't angry. She was just looking at him, the way you look at something you're trying to remember accurately. Then she let the airman escort her off the flight line. The visitor processing office was a small room with 2 plastic chairs and a window that looked out onto the parking lot. The airman Teague, young, clearly uncomfortable, sat across from her and did not know what to say. Evelyn sat quietly and pulled out her phone and spent 40 minutes writing up her documentation of the aileron repair in as much detail as she could recall, with timestamps and location references. She had been there for just over an hour when the door opened, and it wasn't anyone she expected. Lieutenant Kara Voss was 27, with sharp eyes behind a tired face, and she was still in her flight suit from a morning sortie. She looked at the airman, then at Evelyn. "I heard what happened on the flight line," Kara said. She was talking to Evelyn, but she was watching the door behind her, the way people do when they're nervous about being seen somewhere. "It's all right," Evelyn said. "I've been held in worse waiting rooms." "The 307, Kara said. "The aileron repair. I know about it." Evelyn waited. "I saw it 3 weeks ago, I told my instructor. He told me to leave it alone, that maintenance had it handled." She paused. "I checked the maintenance log 2 days later. There was nothing in it. Did you report that?" Kara stopped. "I was going to. But then my next flight evaluation got pushed back a week, and my instructor told me that evaluations were based on how well you functioned as part of the team. She looked at the floor. I was going to report it. I just kept telling myself there was a better time." Evelyn studied her. She didn't say anything judgmental, just nodded, slow and steady. "I need you to write that down," she said. "What you saw, when you saw it, what you were told. Will you do that?" Kara was quiet for a long moment. In the parking lot outside the window, a maintenance truck rolled past, slow and ordinary. "If I do that," Kara said quietly, "what happens to me?" "I don't know exactly," Evelyn said, which was the honest answer. "But I know what happens if you don't." Kara looked at her, really looked at her, and something in Evelyn's face, the steadiness of it, the absence of performance, made the young lieutenant reach into the pocket of her flight suit and pull out a small notebook. "Tell me what to write," Kara said. They were still working when the door opened again, and this time it was Marcus Vale, and his face was different than it had been that morning, tighter, set with something that looked like controlled urgency. "We've got a problem," he said. "The 307 just cleared for its test flight." Evelyn was already on her feet. "Who authorized that?" "Holloway. 20 minutes ago. Someone told him you'd been escorted off the line and the evaluation was suspended, and he pushed the flight through before anything else could slow it down." "The aileron repair?" "I know." His jaw was set. "I know, and I've got one of my senior techs pulling the panel right now, but if Holloway finds out before we finish the inspection, he's going to shut it down." Evelyn picked up her bag. "Can you stall the pre-flight?" "I've got maybe 15 minutes before the pilot is suited up." "That's enough," she said. "Where's the aircraft?" "North end of the flight line. Bay 12. She was already moving. The airman who had been sitting across from her watching the door said, "Wait, you can't just—" "Write everything down," Evelyn said to Kara without stopping. "Every detail, data." And then she was in the hallway and moving fast. And behind her she heard Marcus Vale's boots on the floor keeping pace. And outside the Persang room window, the afternoon sun was cutting hard across the flight line, where somewhere in Bay 12, a pilot was walking toward an aircraft with a repair nobody had been allowed to document, and a wing that had decided its own records mattered more than the lives inside its jets. She hit the exterior door, and the desert heat came off the tarmac like a wall, and she didn't slow down. She crossed the tarmac at a pace that wasn't quite running, because running on a military flight line without an emergency declaration draws attention, and attention was the one thing she couldn't afford right now. But she was moving fast enough that the heat coming off the concrete made the air in front of her shimmer and warp, and her shadow stretched long behind her in the afternoon sun. Marcus Vale was half a step behind her on her left. He didn't ask where she was going or how she planned to handle it. He just moved, which told her something about him. Bay 12 was at the far end of the north flight line, separated from the main maintenance complex by a stretch of open apron that felt longer in the heat than it looked on a map. As they came around the corner of Hangar 6, she could see the 307 already out of the bay, positioned on the edge of the taxiway with the ground crew prepping the exterior checks. The pilot, she didn't know his name yet, was standing beside the aircraft with his helmet bag at his feet, talking to someone from the operations desk. Her tech, Marcus, had said. She scanned the ground crew and found him, a senior airman crouched near the left wing root with a panel half open working fast. The aileron access panel. Good, she angled toward him. One of the ground crew supervisors, a staff sergeant she hadn't dealt with before, stepped into her path. "Ma'am, this is an active prep area. Chief Vale," she said without slowing. Marcus put a hand up behind her. "I've got it. Go." She went around the sergeant and reached the tech at the wing just as he was lifting the edge of the access panel clear. He looked up at her. He was maybe 24, with grease on his forearms and the expression of someone who had been told to work fast and hadn't been told why. "What do you see?" she asked. He turned the panel over in his hands and pointed to the inner surface near the hinge bracket. The repair was visible even at a glance, a section of aluminum skin that had been cut out and replaced with a patch, roughly 15 centimeters across, attached with fasteners that were a different generation than the surrounding hardware, and painted over in a color that was close but not exact. "It's a skin repair," he said. "Looks like impact damage, maybe a ground strike. Patched in-house. Is it logged?" He pulled up his tablet, scrolled again. "No, ma'am. Nothing in the last 4 weeks that matches this." "The fasteners, are they to spec?" He leaned back in to look. His expression changed in a way she recognized. "They're close," he said, "but the torque spec on the bracket is no. That's under-torqued by a lot. An under-torqued fastener on an aileron bracket could fail under the stress of high-G maneuvering. Not would fail could. Maybe 1 flight, maybe 20. The uncertainty was the point. "How long to do it right?" she asked. "To pull the patch, assess the underlying structure, respec the hardware, and reinstall. 4 hours minimum, maybe 6. The pilot was suited up now, helmet in his hand, walking toward the aircraft. Marcus appeared at her shoulder. "Sergeant Waugh is pushing back on me. He's calling Holloway. How long do we have? 5 minutes. Maybe less." She straightened up and walked to meet the pilot before he reached the wing. His name tag read Darrow First Lieutenant, young, maybe his 2nd year on the flight line. He looked at her with the particular wariness of a junior officer who'd been told something was complicated and hadn't been told what. "Lieutenant Darrow," she said, "I'm Evelyn Hart, Deed Flight Safety. There's an unlogged structural repair on your left aileron that your tech has just confirmed is under-torqued on the bracket fasteners. I'm recommending you hold the pre-flight until the repair can be assessed properly." He blinked. Major Holloway cleared the aircraft for flight. Major Holloway doesn't know about the repair. It wasn't in the maintenance file he reviewed. Darrow looked at the aircraft, then at her, then at Marcus, who was standing slightly to one side with his arms at his sides and his face completely unreadable. "Chief Vale," Darrow said. "Is that right?" "The tech confirmed it," Marcus said. "Unlogged repair, non-spec fasteners." The young lieutenant was quiet for 3 seconds. 3 seconds was longer than Evelyn had expected him to hold it, which either meant he was thinking carefully or he was afraid of the answer he was working toward. "I need to call this up," he said. "Yes," Evelyn said. "You do." He reached for the radio on his vest. That was when Major Holloway arrived. He came from the operations building side, walking fast with Sergeant Waugh behind him, and an expression on his face that had moved past professionalism and into something more personal. He was on the tarmac before Darrow had finished his call, and he put himself between the aircraft and Evelyn without quite making it physical. Miss Hart, his voice was clipped and very controlled. I was under the impression you were in the visitor processing office. There's an unlogged aileron repair on this aircraft, she said. The aircraft has been cleared by the Wing Maintenance Authority. The Wing Maintenance Authority didn't know about the repair because it wasn't in the log. Your tech confirmed it 30 seconds ago. It's there, you can look at it right now. Holloway didn't look at the aircraft. He looked at her. Your authorization to conduct independent inspections has been suspended pending security review. Any findings you've collected in the last 24 hours are invalid and cannot be used to hold aircraft. A pilot's life can't be held pending security review, she said. You are not cleared to make that assessment. Then Lieutenant Darrow is. She turned to look at the pilot. He was still holding his radio, looking back and forth between them, with the face of someone who understood exactly what was happening, and was deciding which version of his career he was willing to live with. Holloway turned to Darrow. Lieutenant, the aircraft is cleared. If you're not comfortable with the flight, you can request a weather hold, but there is no maintenance issue on this aircraft. And Ms. Hart is acting outside her authority, Darrow said slowly. Sir, Chief Vale's tech found a non-spec repair on the aileron bracket. Chief Vale, Holloway turned. Your tech's assessment is superseded by the Wing Maintenance Certification, which stands. Marcus Vale stood very still. Something moved in his face, something that looked like a man deciding how much of himself he was willing to spend right here, in the heat, on a patch of tarmac in front of people who had more rank than he did. Sir, Marcus said with respect. If the fastener fails at high G and the aircraft goes down, I signed off on the pre-flight crew. That's on me. It won't fail, Holloway said. You don't know that. The silence that followed lasted about 2 seconds, which on a military flight line with an aircraft about to move felt considerably longer. Then Holloway said, quietly and with great precision, Chief Warrant Officer Vale, you are dismissed from this pre-flight. Return to your duty station. Marcus didn't move right away. He stood there with his jaw set and his hands at his sides, and Evelyn could see what it cost him, the specific arithmetic of it. Years of service weighed against one moment on one afternoon, and she didn't look away from it because she thought it mattered that someone saw it clearly. Then he took one step back and another. Holloway turned back to Darrow and said, Lieutenant, mount up. Darrow looked at Evelyn one more time. She held his gaze. She didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything left to say that hadn't already been said, and she knew from years of knowing these moments that a person either found what they needed in themselves or they didn't, and you couldn't put it there for them. Darrow put on his helmet. Evelyn stepped back and watched him climb the ladder into the cockpit. She went back to her supply room and sat down and did not move for almost 4 minutes, which was as long as she could afford to give to the particular feeling of watching someone walk toward a risk she'd tried to stop. Then she picked up her phone and made a call. The call went to a number that wasn't labeled in her contacts. It rang 4 times before it connected, and when it did, the person on the other end didn't say hello, just said, how bad? Bad enough, she said. 11 aircraft with unsupported certifications. 2 with active structural issues I've personally documented. My records access has been suspended. The Wing's deputy ops officer is running interference. They just sent an aircraft with a non-spec aileron repair on a test flight over my direct safety hold recommendation. A pause. You documented the repair? Photos, tech confirmation on record, timestamp. The tech will hold to that? His chief will. She paused. Probably. What do you need? I need someone above wing level to know this is real before the local command structure buries it. And I need it to happen before they find a way to formally remove me from the base. Another pause longer. That's a short window. Yes, I'll make some calls. Stay on the base. Don't give them clean cause for removal. The call ended. Evelyn set her phone face down on the table and looked at the stack of copied documents beside her laptop. The copies she'd made the night before the suspension. The photographs from the aileron inspection. The notes from her conversation with Lieutenant Voss, handwritten in the young pilot's own hand. She opened her laptop and started writing the full formal report. Not a memo, not a preliminary assessment. The whole thing, properly formatted, cross-referenced, with every timestamp and every discrepancy documented in the specific procedural language that made findings like these difficult to dismiss administratively. It took her 2 hours and 20 minutes. She caught 2 errors and corrected them. She saved it to her encrypted drive in 3 separate formats. The 307 landed safely at 1,618. She could hear it from her supply room, the change in engine noise as it came in on final, and then the particular frequency of tires on tarmac. She let out a breath she hadn't entirely realized she'd been holding. Safe was not the same as fine. The fastener could hold one flight and fail on the next. But the pilot had landed, and she could work with that. Marcus Vale came to see her at 1700. He came in without knocking, which she'd started to understand was just how he was, and sat down in the chair he'd reversed that first time. He looked tired in a way that went past physical, the kind of tired that lives in the decisions you've made. Holloway called me in after the debrief, he said. What did he say? That my tech's finding was unsubstantiated, and that if I had concerns about maintenance integrity, I should raise them through the proper channels. He paused. He used the phrase proper channels 3 times. He's building a paper trail.
Yeah.
I know. He rubbed the back of his neck. He also asked me about you. How long I'd been talking to you, what I'd told you, whether you'd shown me documents outside your authorized access. What did you say? That we'd had 2 conversations? Which is true. She looked at him. He's going to push you to give him something he can use. If you're not willing to do that, he's going to create distance between you and the problem, which means between you and me. Is that advice? It's a prediction. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, my senior tech, Airman Pell, the one who pulled the panel, he wrote up what he found and submitted it through the maintenance management system before Holloway got there. It's in the system now. Hard to make it disappear. That was significant. She kept her expression level, but she felt it land. When did he do that? Right after you walked away. Before I got dismissed, something in Marcus's face shifted, not pride exactly, but something adjacent to it. Kid's 23 years old. I didn't tell him to do it. He did it on his own. He did it on his own. She thought about that for a second. 23 years old, watching something wrong happen, deciding to make a record of it before anyone could stop him. There was something in that she wanted to hold on to. Holloway can still challenge it, she said. He can. He'll say the tech exceeded his authority, that the finding wasn't properly reviewed, that it doesn't constitute a safety hold because the aircraft flew. But it's there, time-stamped, his name on it, and yours now by association.
Yeah.
He didn't look troubled by that. Or if he did, he'd made his peace with it already. There's something else. You asked me before if I'd noticed anything in the long-term records. I told you I hadn't. That wasn't completely true. She waited. 18 months ago, he said, I flagged a pattern in the 400 series inspections. Minor stuff, consumable replacements that were being logged as replaced, when the usage data said they probably weren't. I wrote it up and submitted it to the then maintenance officer. He paused. Who was Holloway in his previous role before he moved to ops? What happened to your report? Nothing. It got logged as received, reviewed, and closed with a finding of no action required. He paused again. I figured I'd missed something. I moved on. Did you keep a copy? I keep copies of everything. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. I need that report. I thought you might. He reached into the chest pocket of his uniform and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Not a printout, an actual physical copy, the kind you make when you want something that doesn't live on a network someone else controls. He put it on the table between them. She picked it up and unfolded it carefully. The maintenance flag report from 18 months ago, signed by Marcus Vale, date stamped, with Holloway's closure notation at the bottom. You had this with you, she said. I've had it in my pocket since yesterday morning. When you found the hydraulic issue on the 404, I went home that night and I found it in my files. He met her eyes. I didn't know what you were when you came here. I thought you were what they said an evaluator from some civilian office who was going to make our lives difficult for a week and then leave. He paused. I'm revising that. What did you decide I am? He looked at her the way people look at something they're still working out. Someone who's been inside the machine, he said, and knows where it breaks. She didn't answer that directly. She refolded the report and put it with her documents. They're going to come for my access again, she said. Probably by tomorrow morning. Maybe sooner if Holloway moves fast. What do you need before that happens? Physical access to the flight line. Tonight, if possible. I need to inspect at least 2 more aircraft on the list before they can formally restrict my movement. He thought about it. Not long, maybe 10 seconds. Night crew comes on at 2,000. I know most of them personally. If you're out there before 2,100, before the ops officer does his walkthrough, I can put you on a routine inspection list as a maintenance observer. It's a gray area, but it's not explicitly prohibited. Good enough, she said. You'll need to be fast. I'm usually fast. He stood up. At the door, he paused in the same spot he'd paused the first morning, hand on the frame. The 307 landed clean, he said. That was he stopped. I'm glad it landed clean. So am I, she said. He left. She ate at her desk that evening a protein bar and the last of a coffee that had gone cold 2 hours earlier and kept working on the report until 1945. When she changed into the spare set of work clothes she kept in her bag, put on the safety vest Marcus had left outside her door, with a note that said Maintenance Observer North Line, and went out to the flight line. The desert night came fast in western Arizona. By 2000, the temperature had dropped 15 degrees, and the stars were doing what stars do in places far from city lights, which was to say everything, filling the sky in a way that made the airfield below look small and temporary. Evelyn had spent enough nights on tarmac, in enough places to find the combination familiar, without finding it comforting. She moved north along the line with a flashlight and her inspection kit, working by the pools of yellow light from the hangar overheads and the small precise beam of her own light. She reached Aircraft 7 on her list, a 404 variant, different from the one she'd flagged day one, and started at the nose gear. She worked the way she always worked, which was quietly, and in a particular order that never changed, because order was what let you notice when something broke the pattern. She was 30 minutes into the inspection, working along the fuselage toward the tail section, when her light picked up something on the underside of the right horizontal stabilizer. She crouched and leaned in. It wasn't structural. It was a wire bundle, the control system wiring that ran through the stabilizer assembly to the elevator actuator, and the bundle was chafed. Not catastrophically, not visibly from the outside, but in the gap between two support clips, the insulation had worn through on two of the wires, exposing conductor. And the exposed sections were close enough together that under the right vibration conditions they could contact. Electrical contact in a flight control wire bundle was not a subtle failure mode. She photographed it 6 times from 3 different angles and wrote up the finding in her notebook with the aircraft serial number, the location reference, and the timestamp. Then she kept going. She found the third aircraft 40 minutes later. Same problem, different location chafed wiring in the same general control system, same style of wear pattern. The kind that happens when wire bundles are routed slightly wrong during reassembly and then rub against the structure over time. The kind that gets missed on visual inspection if you're looking at the surface and not the spaces in between. 2 aircraft with the same failure mode was a pattern. A pattern meant it wasn't random maintenance error. It meant either a systemic training problem in how the aircraft were being reassembled, or someone was cutting corners in the same place repeatedly, or both. She was photographing the third aircraft's finding when she heard a vehicle. It came slowly, a maintenance cart moving along the far side of the flight line, heading north. She kept her flashlight low and stayed close to the fuselage, working by touch as much as light, and watched the cart's progress from the corner of her eye. It stopped about 4 aircraft down. 2 figures got out. One of them had the outline of someone with officer, rank, the posture, the bearing, the way they moved with the expectation of being obeyed. The cart's headlights were pointed away from her, but the figure's radio lit briefly as he raised it to his mouth, and in the pale light from the radio display, she could see enough of his profile. Holloway, at this hour on the flight line, walking toward the aircraft on her inspection list. She stayed very still. The second figure went to the aircraft immediately below her target, the one she hadn't reached yet, and opened an access panel without pulling out an inspection kit or a flashlight. He stood at the panel for perhaps 90 seconds. Then he closed it and they walked back to the cart. The cart turned around and headed south, back toward the operations building. Evelyn stayed where she was until the sound of the motor faded. Then she walked quickly to the aircraft they'd stopped at and found the panel they'd opened, left fuselage, maintenance access door, low section, and looked inside. The panel contained the maintenance log insert board, the physical card that records on-aircraft documentation between digital log entries. The insert board was empty. The card that had been there had been removed. She stood in the dark with the empty panel in front of her and her flashlight on the space where the card had been, and she understood precisely what she had just watched. Holloway had come out to the flight line at 2100 to pull physical maintenance records from an aircraft she was scheduled to inspect. He'd done it in person at night without a log entry or a crew. She photographed the empty panel, photographed the date stamp on the mounting bracket that showed when the insert board had last been serviced, wrote the time in her notebook. Then she walked back to her supply room and called the same unlabeled number. 4 rings. Then go ahead. I need you to accelerate whatever calls you are making, she said. It's moved past negligence. Someone just destroyed physical maintenance records from a flight line aircraft. Tonight, I witnessed it. How confident are you in what you saw? Completely. Another pause. Longer this time. There are people on their way to Red Mesa, the voice on the other end said. Dodd Egg and a JAG team. They've been in staging since this afternoon based on your earlier call. I can have them on site by 600. Evelyn exhaled slowly. Do it. Can you hold your position until morning? Yes. Don't let them formally remove you before 600. I won't. The call ended. She put the phone down and looked at her encrypted drive and her documents, and the window of her supply room that showed nothing but the dark outside and the distant lights of the flight line, and she thought about Holloway walking in the dark pulling records off an aircraft, and the young tech who'd filed his finding before anyone could tell him not to, and Kara Voss writing things down in her notebook with her hands slightly unsteady, and Marcus Vale carrying an 18-month-old report in his chest pocket, like something he'd been waiting to hand to the right person. She was still thinking about all of it when her laptop screen lit up with an incoming message through the base's internal communication system. The sender ID was listed as Wing Administrative Office, and the message was 4 lines long. It informed her that a formal cause of removal order had been prepared citing interference with active operations and unauthorized contact with restricted maintenance personnel. It informed her that the order would be executed at 700 the following morning, at which point her base access credentials would be revoked, and she would be escorted off the installation. It informed her that per DoD Regulation 4140.1R, she had the right to submit a written objection within 12 hours. And it informed her that Colonel Devin Strake, Wing Commander, had personally reviewed and signed the order. Evelyn read it twice. Then she opened a new document and started writing her formal objection, because 12 hours gas for until 200, and she had no intention of giving them anything they could use to say she hadn't followed procedure. She was halfway through the objection when a knock came at her door, not Marcus's knock, which she'd already learned was 2 quick raps, and not the administrative sound of someone delivering paperwork. This was softer, uncertain. She said, "Come in." The door opened and Kara Voss stood in the frame with her notebook in her hands, still in her flight suit, and she'd clearly been sitting somewhere, working up the nerve to be here for a while, because her face had the look of someone who had already had the argument with themselves and won. I finished writing everything down, Kara said. Everything I saw, everything I was told, the dates. She paused. And then I went through my own flight log and I found something else. Evelyn looked at her. What did you find? Kara stepped into the room and put the notebook on the table and opened it to a specific page. Her handwriting was small and careful, and the page was dense with it. 2 months ago, Kara said, I was assigned a training flight on the 307. The same aircraft. My instructor signed off on my completion log, but she stopped, took a breath. I didn't fly that day. The weather was red and the flight was scrubbed. But my log shows a completed sortie, 2 hours and 14 minutes. Evelyn went very still. Someone logged a flight in your name, she said, on a day you didn't fly. Yes. On the 307, yes. The 307. The aircraft with the unlogged aileron repair. The aircraft that Holloway had cleared for a test flight over a safety recommendation. The aircraft whose maintenance history was now part of a fraudulent readiness record that included, apparently, flight hours that had never happened. Kara, Evelyn said, very carefully, do you understand what this means? The young lieutenant looked at her with eyes that were tired and clear and fully awake. It means they used my name to fake a flight log. And that makes you a witness, Evelyn said. Not just to what you saw, but to what was done to you. Kara Voss didn't answer right away. She looked down at her notebook, at the careful lines of writing that had taken her courage to put there. Then she looked back up. What time do you need me here tomorrow morning? She said. Evelyn looked at the clock on her laptop. 2147. The Dodd Idge team was in staging. The objection needed to be filed by 200. The removal order was set for 700, 6 hours before the team arrived. And somewhere on this base, Major Grant Holloway had just destroyed a maintenance record and didn't know yet that anyone had watched him do it. Be here at 530, Evelyn said, and bring a second copy of everything you wrote. Kara left at 2210, with her notebook tucked under her arm and the look of someone who had made a decision they couldn't unmake and had decided that was all right. Evelyn listened to her footsteps fade down the hallway and then turned back to her laptop and kept writing. The formal objection to the removal order took another 40 minutes to complete. She wrote it in the specific procedural language that DoD administrative hearings required: citation numbers, regulatory references, a point-by-point rebuttal of each cause listed in the order, It wasn't the most important document she'd written that night, but it was the one that bought her time. And time was the architecture everything else depended on right now. She filed it through the base's internal system at 148, 12 minutes before the deadline, and kept a time-stamped copy on her drive. Then she set an alarm for 430 and lay down on the floor of the supply room with her jacket rolled under her head. Because the chair didn't recline and the table was too narrow, and she had learned a long time ago to sleep wherever and whenever the situation allowed, because the situations that didn't allow it always came eventually. She slept for 2 hours and 40 minutes without dreaming, which was about what she'd expected. At 445 she was up, washed her face in the maintenance bay bathroom, ate the last protein bar from her bag, and sat down to organize everything she had into a single comprehensive package. Not the formal report she'd finished the night before. This was the handoff file, the document you prepare when you know other people are going to take over, and you need everything to be clear enough that they can move without you explaining it. She labeled each section by finding, cross-referenced the photographs to the written observations, and included the maintenance flag report Marcus had given her with a notation about when and how it had been obtained. She added Airman Pell's time-stamped system entry about the aileron repair. She added her witness account of Holloway on the flight line at 2100, with the time notation and the description of the empty insert board panel. She added a section at the end titled Personnel Accounts and left 2 blank pages for what Kara Voss was going to bring her at 530. At 512, Marcus Vale knocked twice on the door and came in without waiting. He looked like he'd slept about as much as she had, which was to say not enough, but he was alert in the way that people who spent years doing maintenance work in high-stakes environments learned to be alert, not energized, just on. "You filed the objection," he said. At 148, he nodded. Holloway was in the ops building at 400. "I heard it from the duty sergeant. He was going through something in the operations records annex." She looked at him. The annex, not the digital system. Physical files. Pre-digital error logs, the kind that don't have an edit history. She understood what that meant. The digital records had audit trails, timestamps, user IDs, modification logs. Physical files didn't. If there was documentation from early enough in the base's readiness program that predated the digital system, that was where you went to change history without leaving a fingerprint. "How old does the readiness program go?" she asked. "The falsified certifications. Best I can piece it together, it started about 2.5 years ago. But the physical annex goes back further. If he's in there, he's either covering something that started earlier than I thought, or he's creating a paper foundation to make the current records look like they're part of a longer-standing legitimate practice," she said. Marcus looked at her. "Can he do that? Would that hold?" "It might complicate things. It would take investigators longer to untangle, which is the point." She paused. "The IG team arrives at 600. If he gets enough planted before then, the early record becomes contested, and the whole investigation slows down by weeks. So we need to get someone into that annex before 600. I can't go. My access is suspended, and if I'm found in a restricted records area before the IG arrives, they'll use it to invalidate everything I've documented." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "I have duty access to the annex. Maintenance records go there for archival. If you go in and he's there, you're walking into something you can't easily walk back from." "I know." She looked at him directly. "I need you to understand what I'm asking." "You're not asking. You're informing me of a situation." He said it flatly, without drama. "There's a difference." She let that sit for a second. Then she said, "If you go in and he's there, don't confront him. Don't say anything about what you know. Just observe. If he has physical records in his hands, note which files. Note the time. Note where he puts them when he leaves. And if he's already gone, then look at what's been pulled from the shelves. The dust patterns will show you what's been moved recently. Photograph everything you can." He was already moving toward the door. "I'll be back before 530. Be careful." He paused at the door, not looking back. "I'm always careful," he said. "It just doesn't always help." Kara arrived at 526 with 2 copies of her statement as promised, and a third document Evelyn hadn't expected. A printed screenshot of her personal flight log, the version maintained in the squadron's pilot management system, showing the falsified sortie entry on the 307, with a timestamp that post-dated the actual scrubbed flight by approximately 14 hours. 14 hours, Evelyn said, looking at the timestamp. Whoever entered it did it the same evening the flight was scrubbed. Not right away, it was entered at around 2000, after the duty day was over. Kara sat down in the chair Marcus usually used. She looked tired but steady. I didn't notice it at the time. I wasn't looking at my log that closely. You don't usually look at completed entries unless something flags them. Who has access to pilot flight logs in the management system? Squadron Operations Officer, Wing Ops Staff. The admin clerks who manage the system for the Wingdo's office. She paused. Major Holloway was the Wingdaw's deputy 18 months ago and has been the DAW for the last year. His staff handles the admin access. Evelyn wrote it down and added it to the handoff file. The picture it created was not subtle. A Wing Deputy Operations Officer who had been suppressing maintenance concerns for at least 18 months, who had fraudulently certified aircraft readiness, who had falsified pilot flight records in the management system, and who was now, as of 4 this morning, attempting to preempt a federal investigation by altering physical archive records. She added the flight log screenshot to the handoff file. At 541, Marcus came back. He came in fast, closed the door behind him, and for just a moment his expression had the look of a man who had seen something he was still processing. Then it smoothed out and he sat down. He was gone by the time I got there, he said. But he'd been there. 5 boxes pulled from the 2019-2021 readiness records section. 3 of them looked like they'd been gone through dividers out of order, files not seated properly. Someone in a hurry. Did you photograph it? He put his phone on the table. 47 photos, shelf positions, file positions, the specific boxes he went through, close-ups of the files that had been disturbed. He paused. There was one thing. What? One of the files had a paperclip on the outside. New clip, shiny, no rust, no wear. On a physical record from 2020, he looked at her. Someone put that there recently. Like a placeholder. Or a marker. She thought about that. A marker on a specific file in a box that had been recently accessed. Did you photograph the file with the clip? Yes. And I opened it. It was a readiness certification summary for a 12-month period, ending in early 2021. All clean, all properly documented. He paused again. Too clean. The formatting was consistent with the current digital template, not the one they were using in 2021. I've been doing this long enough to know the difference. She understood. He created a clean historical record and filed it in the archive. Physical document, paper file, predating the falsification period. If an investigator found it without knowing what to look for, it would suggest the readiness program had a clean history before things went wrong, which makes everything that came after look like isolated errors instead of a deliberate pattern. Can they prove it's fake? Paper forensics, ink dating, possibly. The template inconsistency is a start. The paperclip is a start. She looked at the 47 photographs on Marcus's phone. This is a start. She added his account and the photo evidence to the handoff file. It was 553. The Dodge team arrived in 2 vehicles at 604, not 600, because the access checkpoint at the main gate had slowed them for 4 minutes, which was 4 minutes Evelyn spent standing at the window of her supply room, watching the dawn come up over the flight line and thinking about all the ways the next hour could go sideways. The lead investigator was a woman named Special Agent Renata Odom, and she moved through the base's administrative center with the particular efficiency of someone who had done this enough times that the logistics didn't take any of her attention anymore. She was compact and deliberate, and she shook Evelyn's hand once firmly and said, "I've read your preliminary report. Walk me through the physical evidence." Evelyn walked her through it, all of it in order, with the handoff file open on the table between them. Odom had a second agent taking notes and a third on a laptop entering evidence references into a case management system in real time. The JAG officer, a major named Briscoe, tall with the look of someone who had not slept either, stood to the side and asked 2 specific questions about chain of custody, both of which Evelyn answered correctly, and then was quiet. It took 31 minutes. At the end, Odom looked at the handoff file, and then at Evelyn and said, "The records annex. You have photo documentation of the accessed boxes?" Chief Vale documented it. "His phone is the original source. I can have him here in 10 minutes. Get him here now." Evelyn sent a message. Marcus arrived in 6 minutes, which meant he'd been close, which meant he'd been waiting. He handed his phone to Odom's evidence tech and answered questions for 12 minutes while the tech transferred the photographs. He was precise and careful, and he didn't elaborate beyond what he'd actually seen, which was exactly right. At 648, Odom stepped into the hallway to make a call. She was on the phone for 8 minutes. When she came back, her expression had shifted slightly, not visibly to most people, but Evelyn had been reading operational faces for long enough to catch it. Colonel Strake has been notified that a federal investigation is underway, Odom said. Per protocol, the wing commander has been informed that his command authority over the investigation subjects is suspended pending review. That covers Holloway and anyone in his immediate administrative chain. The removal order, Evelyn said, stayed. You have full access pending investigation. Odom looked at her for a moment. The removal order itself is now evidence. It was signed at 1,900 hours last night, approximately 2 hours after you documented Holloway's obstruction of your safety hold recommendation on the 307. She paused. That's not a coincidence, no, Evelyn said. It isn't. Major Grant Holloway was informed of the investigation's existence at 712 when Odom's team appeared at his office door with the JAG officer and a notification letter. Evelyn wasn't present for that. She was down the hall in the wing administrative suite, sitting across from Colonel Strake, which was a different kind of conversation. Strake was 63, a career officer, and he had the face of a man who was doing rapid and painful arithmetic about how much he had known and when and how that was going to look. He had signed the removal order. His name was on the flight certifications as the wing commander who had authority over the readiness program. Whether he had been actively involved or passively complicit, the arithmetic was not friendly to him. He looked at her across his desk and said, Miss Hart. He said it the way people say a name when they're trying to figure out who they're actually dealing with. Colonel, your authorization clearance. He had the DOD authorization document on his desk, the one-page letter she'd come in on. He looked at it differently now than he had 4 days ago. The Aviation Safety Directorate. Yes, sir. I've been in this branch for 31 years, he said slowly, and I have never had a Tier 2 evaluator from the Aviation Safety Directorate at one of my installations. She didn't say anything. The clearance level on this document, he said, is higher than what ASD normally issues. I should have looked at it more carefully when you arrived. Yes, sir. He set the document down. He looked at his hands briefly. Then he looked at her. What I need to know right now, Miss Hart, is whether there's anything about this investigation that is going to affect the operational status of my pilots who had no involvement in the readiness program. That's a question for the IG, she said. But my assessment is that the pilots in the operational squadrons who weren't directly involved in the certification process aren't the target. The documentation points to a small number of people in administrative and maintenance leadership. Holloway. She didn't confirm or deny. It wasn't her call to make in this room. Strake looked at the document one more time. You found a hydraulic fault in 11 minutes on the first morning, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, sir. My 3 senior maintainers had the bird for 2 days. Yes, sir. He was quiet for a moment. Something moved in his face, something complicated and not entirely comfortable, and then he stood up and extended his hand across the desk. She shook it. By 900, the investigation had expanded from a federal safety review into a formal criminal inquiry, which changed the operational tempo significantly. Odom's team was joined by 2 additional agents who had been staged at the nearest regional office overnight. The records annex was secured, physically sealed with IG tape on the door and a guard posted outside. The wing's digital administrative system was locked for forensic imaging. Holloway had been informed he was the subject of a criminal investigation and advised of his rights. He had immediately requested to speak with a JAG attorney, which was his right, and had been directed to remain on base. Mercer was a different matter. Evelyn was in the IG's temporary operations room. They'd commandeered a conference room 2 doors from her supply room when Odom came in and sat down across from her. Mercer, Odom said. About him. He escorted you off the flight line yesterday during the 307 pre-flight inspection. He did it on Holloway's behalf, or at least in coordination with Holloway's decision to clear the aircraft. That makes him a potential accessory to the obstruction, depending on what he knew and when he knew it. She paused. Did he give you any indication that he was aware of the unlogged aileron repair? Evelyn thought about the moment on the flight line, the 1 second where something had flickered in Mercer's face before he'd closed it over. He had a moment of hesitation when I told him about the repair. I can't tell you whether that was because he already knew, or because what I said landed and he didn't want it to. How long was the hesitation? Under 2 seconds. That's not enough to establish foreknowledge. No. Odom made a note. What's your read on him? Beyond the professional conduct issues. Evelyn thought about it. Mercer was arrogant. He was the kind of arrogant that came from a record that was real actual flight hours, actual competence, accomplishments to support a level of confidence that had curdled over time into something uglier. But there was a difference between a man who mocked a civilian evaluator because he genuinely believed she didn't belong, and a man who covered up a maintenance fault that could kill a pilot. I think he's a problem, she said. I don't think he's the problem. He used your professional dismissal as cover, Osm said. The day you arrived, his behavior toward you established a narrative that made it easier for everyone on this base to dismiss what you were finding. Whether or not he understood, that's what he was doing. Yes, Evelyn said. That's accurate. Odom closed her notebook. We're going to need to speak with Lieutenant Voss this morning. What's her state? Prepared. She came in with 2 copies of her statement and the flight log documentation. Evelyn paused. She's young and she's scared, but she knows what she saw, and she decided to stand behind it. Don't crowd her in the interview. Give her room. Odom looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who was recalibrating. You coach witnesses often? I observe people, Evelyn said. It's part of what I do. Kara Voss gave her statement to Odom's team at 1015 in a side room off the conference area, and she was in there for 93 minutes. Evelyn sat in the hallway outside and didn't listen, but tracked the tone through the wall. No raised voices, no long silences, just the steady rhythm of a conversation where both sides were working toward the same thing. When Kara came out, her face was pale and slightly drawn, the way faces look after you've spent an hour talking about something that cost you to carry. She sat down next to Evelyn in the hallway. Okay, she said. Okay, Evelyn said back. They sat in silence for a moment. They asked about my instructor, Kara said. Lieutenant Colonel Maddox. He was the one who told me to leave the aileron thing alone. What did you tell them? Everything. She looked at her hands. He might be in trouble. He might be. He's not a bad... She stopped. Started again. He's not someone I thought was dishonest. The people involved in things like this usually aren't someone anyone thought was dishonest, Evelyn said. That's how it runs for as long as it does. Kara nodded slowly. After a moment, she said, someone put a fake flight in my log, in my name, and I didn't know. She paused. That feels weird. Like someone was walking around wearing my face. You didn't do anything wrong. I know. She shook her head. I keep thinking I should have caught it. You caught it when it mattered, Evelyn said. That's what counts. Kara looked at her. Really looked, the way she had in the processing office 2 days ago, searching for something in Evelyn's face. Whatever she found there seemed to settle something in her, and she straightened up slightly. Can I ask you something? Kara said. Yes. Your authorization. The clearance level. Holloway was talking this morning before the IG showed up. I heard it from the ops duty clerk. He was saying, you misrepresented your credentials, that a Tier 2 ASD evaluator doesn't have the kind of access you were using. She paused. Is that true? Evelyn looked at the far wall for a moment. Then she looked back at Kara. My authorization was exactly what it said it was, she said. What people here assumed it meant and what it actually meant were 2 different things. What does it actually mean? Evelyn considered how much to say. Not because she was trying to be evasive. She was past the point in this situation where careful information management served any useful purpose, but because the answer was the kind of thing that changed how people looked at everything that had come before it, and she wanted to frame it right. The Aviation Safety Directorate, she said, is the civilian designation. The program it's attached to isn't. Kara waited. I came here as an evaluator, Evelyn said. I have been an evaluator on 6 other installations in the last 4 years. Before that, I was a flight surgeon attached to a tactical aviation unit for 11 years, which is a position that requires current flight qualification in the aircraft the unit operates. She paused. I'm not just qualified to look at an aircraft, Lieutenant. I'm qualified to fly it. The hallway was quiet. The VALKYRIE designation, Kara said. Her voice had gone slightly different in the old tactical unit histories. There's a call sign. That's not something I'm going to confirm in a hallway, Evelyn said, and her voice was gentle about it but completely final. Kara absorbed that. She sat with it for a moment. Then quietly she said, the pilots who were trained to honor that call sign. They made us read the after-action reports in flight school, the ones that were declassified. She paused. There was one about a rescue extraction under fire, a pilot who took a damaged aircraft into contested airspace to reach a downed crew. Evelyn didn't answer. She brought them home, Kara said. All 4 of them. The hallway was very quiet. After a moment, Evelyn said, whatever you think you know right now, today, this investigation is what matters. The rest is background, Kara nodded. She didn't push. But when she stood up to leave, she moved differently than she had when she'd sat down with something in her bearing that hadn't been there before. Something that looked like a direction she'd decided to walk in. At 1300, Odom called a status meeting in the commandeered conference room. Evelyn was included along with the JAG officer Briscoe and the 2 additional agents. Marcus Vale was not included, but Evelyn had briefed him in the hallway beforehand because she believed he'd earned it. Odom laid out what the morning had produced. The digital forensic imaging of the wing's administrative system had identified 43 instances of modification to readiness certification records, all traceable to 3 user accounts: Holloway's, an admin clerk under his office, and a 3rd account belonging to Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Maddox Cara's flight instructor. The modification spanned 14 months. The physical records annex had yielded what Marcus had documented: a fraudulent 2020-2021 readiness summary planted among legitimate archive files, with paper forensics showing ink composition inconsistent with the date range on the document. The paperclip Marcus had flagged turned out to mark the inserted document precisely. Airman Pell's maintenance system entry about the aileron repair had already been logged in the federal evidence chain. Cara's flight log documentation had been entered as evidence of record falsification affecting personnel files. "We're requesting a detention hold on Holloway through the base commander," Odom said. "He's a flight risk, not physical flight, but document risk. If he accesses any additional systems or physical records while the investigation is active, it compounds the obstruction charges significantly." She paused. "Colonel Strake has cooperated fully. His involvement appears to be failure of oversight rather than active participation. But that determination belongs to the DoD, Mercer Briscoe said. "We've interviewed him. He denies knowledge of the unlogged aileron repair prior to Ms. Hart's finding. His account of the flight line interaction is consistent with what Ms. Hart documented, including the dismissal order to the airman." She looked at her notes. "He claims Holloway called him directly the morning of the 307 pre-flight and told him Ms. Hart's authority had been suspended and she was to be removed from the aircraft. He acted on that instruction." "Did he know the instruction was false?" Briscoe asked. "He says no, that's his position." Odom looked at Evelyn. "Your assessment?" Evelyn thought about it one more time. The hesitation on the flight line, the way he'd used her dismissal, the ease of it, the pleasure in it, as a mechanism for doing what Holloway had asked him to do. "I think he told himself he didn't need to know," she said. "That's not the same as not knowing." Odom wrote it down. The meeting broke at 1347. Evelyn was in the hallway gathering her files when her phone buzzed with a message from the unlabeled contact. She stopped and read it. "Team has reviewed your full report. There's a secondary element. The 400 series aircraft, the 2 with the wiring faults. Check the modification history, specifically the wire bundle routing standard. There's a DoD circular from 2021 that changed the routing spec for that airframe. Check if it was implemented at Red Mesa." She read it twice. Then she went to find the network terminal she'd been authorized to use under the IG's access restoration and pulled up the DoD circular database. The 2021 circular was there. It had changed the wire bundle routing standard for the 400 series to address a known wear pattern in the original spec. Every installation with 400 series aircraft had been required to implement the modification within 18 months of the circular's publication date. She pulled up Red Mesa's implementation records for DoD circulars. The 2021 routing circular wasn't listed as implemented. She pulled up the submission record, the document that should have been filed when the wing received the circular. It had been received. The acknowledgement was there, dated 2 months after publication. The implementation record was missing. She pulled up Holloway's administrative access history. He had accessed the circular implementation records 11 months ago. His last access to that specific record was 2 months after the circular's publication, the same week the acknowledgement had been filed, which meant Holloway had known about the wire routing change, had received the circular, had filed the acknowledgement that Red Mesa was aware of it, and had never implemented it. The chafed wiring on the 2 400 series aircraft she'd found the previous night wasn't random maintenance error. It wasn't even negligent oversight. The failure pattern was the exact failure pattern the 2021 circular had been written to prevent, in the exact location the circular had identified as high risk, on aircraft that should have been modified 18 months ago. If the wiring had failed on either of those aircraft in flight, a control system short in the elevator wiring under high G loading, the result would not have been recoverable. She was still at the terminal, pulling the supporting documents, when she heard Odom's voice behind her. "What did you find?" Evelyn turned. Odom was in the doorway with her notebook, and there was something in her face, a sharpness that hadn't been there even this morning. It's not just fraudulent certifications, Evelyn said, and it's not just a failure to document repairs. There was a DoD airworthiness circular that required a modification to the 400 series aircraft. Wire bundle routing, known failure point. She turned the screen so Odom could see it. Holloway received it, acknowledged it, never implemented it. Odom stepped closer and looked at the screen. The 2 aircraft I inspected last night, Evelyn said, both have the failure pattern the circular was designed to prevent. So we're not looking at falsified paperwork anymore, Odom said quietly. No, Evelyn said. We're looking at a decision. Someone received a mandatory airworthiness modification, understood what it was for, and chose not to implement it. That's not administrative negligence. That's knowing disregard for aircraft safety with documented understanding of the risk. Odom was very still for a moment. Then she said, I need to make a call. She stepped back into the hallway. Evelyn turned back to the screen and kept pulling documents. She was 4 pages deep into the circular's implementation history when the base intercom system crackled to life across the ceiling, speakers in the hallway, the base-wide channel, the one used for emergency announcements and command-level communications. The voice was the base operations duty officer, and he sounded like a man who was reading something he'd been handed 30 seconds ago and wasn't sure what it meant. Attention all personnel, Red Mesa Tactical Air Station. This is a base-wide notification. Effective immediately by order of the Department of Defense Inspector General's Office, all flight operations at Red Mesa are suspended pending completion of an active federal safety investigation. This suspension applies to all aircraft and all squadrons. This is not a drill. All pilots and maintenance personnel are to report to their duty stations and remain available for interview. All aircraft are grounded until further notice. The intercom clicked off. In the silence that followed, Evelyn could hear the sounds of the base-changing voices rising in the distance, doors opening, footsteps moving with the particular energy of people who have just heard something they weren't expecting and don't yet know what it means for them. The sound of a base-sized reckoning arriving all at once. And then, from somewhere down the hallway outside the records room, she heard a different sound, one she recognized before she consciously identified it, because she'd heard it in enough hangars and ready rooms over the years to know it the way you know a song from the first 2 notes. It was Mercer's voice. Raised. Not shouting not yet, but the kind of controlled loud that men use when they're trying to maintain authority over a situation that is leaving them behind. She couldn't make out the words, but she could hear the shape of it, the specific cadence of a man who had spent his career being the most important person in any room and was currently becoming aware that was no longer true. Evelyn saved the document she'd pulled, closed the terminal, and picked up her files. She walked out of the records room into the hallway, and at the far end she could see Mercer standing with 2 of Odom's agents, his jaw set and his hands at his sides and his flight suit, looking suddenly like something that didn't fit the situation he was in. One of the agents was holding a mallet and saying something in a low voice, and Mercer was shaking his head in the way people shake their heads when they're being told something they haven't decided yet whether to believe. He looked up and saw Evelyn. The distance between them was maybe 30 feet of linoleum floor and overhead fluorescent light, and he looked at her the way people look at something they underestimated badly enough that the error is still catching up to them. His jaw worked once. She could see him deciding what to say, what posture to take, what version of himself to present right now. She didn't stop. She didn't speed up. She just walked past him at the same pace she'd walked across the flight line 4 days ago, and she didn't look away, but she didn't perform it either. She just looked at him the way she looked at everything clearly, and without embellishment, and kept moving. Behind her, she heard one of the agents say his name and ask him to come with them. She turned the corner and went back to her supply room and sat down and opened her laptop, because there was still work to do, and the work was the point. Her phone buzzed again, same unlabeled contact. This time it was 3 words. Check Mercer's logbook. She stared at the message for a long moment. Then she picked up the phone and called Odom. Odom picked up on the second ring. Check Mercer's logbook, Evelyn said. Physical logbook, not the digital flight management record. The one he keeps himself. A pause. What am I looking for? I don't know yet. But someone who has been watching this investigation from above my level just flagged it, and they don't flag things without a reason. Another pause, shorter. I'll send someone to his quarters. He's in the hallway with your agents right now. He hasn't been told to go anywhere yet. Good. Odom's voice shifted slightly, the way it did when she was already moving. I'll have the room accessed in the next 20 minutes. What's the source of the tip? A contact I can't name in this conversation, Evelyn said. but the previous information from the same source was accurate. Good enough. The call ended. Evelyn set her phone down and looked at the wall for a moment, running through what she knew about Cole Mercer. The record that had looked good on paper. 200 hours in the aircraft he flew, which he'd mentioned like it was armor. The ease with which he'd moved against her. The speed of it. Not the speed of someone following an instruction he'd just received, but the speed of someone who already knew how the play was supposed to go. She pulled up the wing's publicly available personnel directory on her laptop and found Mercer's service summary. Standard fighter pilot career trajectory, flight school, first assignment, advanced qualification, current posting at Red Mesa. The dates were clean, the ratings were clean. He had an accommodation from 18 months ago for she looked closer outstanding contributions to Squadron Readiness Assessment. Squadron Readiness Assessment, 18 months ago, which was approximately when Marcus Vale had flagged the consumable replacement discrepancies in the 400 series inspections, submitted the report to Holloway, and received a closure notation of no action required. She wrote the date down and added it to her file. The 20 minutes Odom had estimated became 35, which Evelyn spent finishing her documentation of the DoD circular findings and eating half of a granola bar she found at the bottom of her bag that had been there long enough to be slightly stale. She ate it anyway because she hadn't had a real meal since the night before, and the afternoon was moving fast. At 1433, Odom appeared in the doorway of the supply room and closed the door behind her, which was new. She sat down across from Evelyn and put a photograph on the table between them. It was a printed image of a handwritten page, dense, careful cursive, the kind of handwriting that belonged to someone who'd been taught to write well before everything went digital. His personal logbook, Odom said. Pilots keep them as supplemental records. Not required, but common practice. He had one going back 12 years. Evelyn looked at the photograph. The page showed flight log entries, date, aircraft duration, conditions, note, standard format. But in the notes column on 3 specific entries over a 14-month period, there was a notation that appeared in different forms, but with consistent meaning. CERT coordination on 2 entries and RPC review on a 3rd, Evelyn said. Readiness program coordination, Odom said. Not an official designation. Not a program that exists in the wing's organizational structure. She tapped the photograph, but it appears in Mercer's personal log on 3 dates that correspond to certification windows for 3 of the 11 aircraft on your list. Evelyn looked at the dates. Then she looked at the personnel directory page she'd been working from and checked the date of Mercer's readiness assessment commendation. It fell between the 2nd and 3rd RPC log entries. He wasn't just following Holloway's instruction on the flight line, Evelyn said. No, Odom said. It looks like he was part of the coordination structure. Holloway needed someone in the operational pilot community to validate that the aircraft were performing as certified. A pilot with 200 hours in the aircraft who could say, yes, I've flown this bird. It's performing within parameters. That kind of validation is harder to challenge administratively than a maintenance sign-off alone, and in exchange. The possibly other things. We're pulling his assignment preference records to see if there were any favorable postings or evaluations during the same window. Evelyn sat with that for a moment. The picture it made wasn't the picture she'd originally had of Mercer, the arrogant golden boy who'd stumbled into the cleanup operation without understanding what he was part of. The picture it made was colder than that. A man who had understood exactly what was happening and had provided the specific professional cover it needed to hold together. The hesitation on the flight line, she said. When I told him about the aileron repair, he knew, Odom said. At least that's the emerging read. He may not have known about the specific repair on the 307 that could have been a maintenance action that happened beneath the level of detail he was engaged with. But he knew the 307 certification was unsupported, which means when you told him about the repair, he was doing arithmetic about whether it was something that could be managed or something that had gotten too big. He decided it could be managed. He removed you from the aircraft and called up to Holloway within 2 minutes. We have the call record. Evelyn looked at the photograph again. The careful handwriting. The notes in the margin of his own personal log that nobody had asked him to keep, that nobody had required him to maintain, that he'd kept out of the same habit that pilots keep for 12 years, because it's what you do, because the logbook is yours. The evidence that would undo him was evidence he had made himself. What happens now? She asked. I'm interviewing him again at 1500, Odom said, with the logbook entries on the table. He's had 30 minutes since his room was accessed to understand that something has changed. But he doesn't know what yet. She paused. I'd like you available nearby in case I have technical questions about the aircraft certifications. I'll be there. The 1500 interview happened in the same side room where Kara had given her statement that morning, and Evelyn sat in the hallway outside with the door 3 inches open and her file on her lap, listening to the room the same way she'd listened before, not to the words, which she couldn't reliably make out, but to the rhythm. The first 15 minutes were measured, and even Odom's controlled tempo, Mercer's responses holding a professional cadence. The kind of conversation where both sides are still deciding what they know. Then there was a pause, longer than the natural gaps in conversation. The kind of pause that happens when something is put on a table. After the pause, Mercer's voice changed register, not loud, not the controlled loud of the hallway that morning. Something different, lower, tighter, the sound of a structure beginning to take on weight it hadn't been designed for. Evelyn looked at the granola bar wrapper she was still holding and put it in her bag. 12 minutes later, the door opened and Odom came out. She looked at Evelyn and said, "Technical question. The RPC certification windows in Mercer's log the aircraft certifications that correspond to those dates. When a pilot provides validation testimony for a readiness certification, what form does that take? Is it a signed document? Typically, yes. A pilot validation statement, countersigned by the operations officer. It's supplemental to the maintenance certification, but it adds a second tier of verification." Evelyn paused. If those statements exist for the falsified certifications, they would have Mercer's signature on them. Would they be in the wing administrative records? They should be filed with the certification package. If the digital records were modified, the pilot validation statements might still be in the physical certification files. They're often attached as separate pages, not integrated into the system. Odom looked at her for exactly 2 seconds. Then she went back into the room and closed the door. Evelyn heard Mercer's voice again, and this time she could make out the specific shape of the sound, even if not the words. And the shape was a man discovering that the version of the situation he'd been working with was no longer the version on offer. At 1612, a team from the IG's forensic division pulled the physical certification packages from the wing's administrative files, the hard copy folders that lived in the file cabinets alongside the digital records, the ones that hadn't been targeted in Holloway's annex operation, because Holloway hadn't known they'd be relevant yet. 3 of the 11 falsified certification packages contained pilot validation statements. All 3 were signed by Captain Cole Mercer. All 3 were dated within the RPC windows noted in his personal logbook. All 3 carried his certification that the aircraft had been confirmed operationally sound based on personal flight assessment for aircraft whose test flights had never happened. The forensic agent who processed the finding brought the folder to Odom at 1638 in the temporary operations room, and Odom set it on the table with the careful deliberateness of someone who understands that what they're holding is the difference between an administrative case and a criminal one. Evelyn was at the table when it arrived. She looked at the signatures, Mercer's handwriting, neat and consistent across all 3 documents, the kind of signature that had been written by a man who had believed, on each of those 3 occasions, that the risk of what he was doing was manageable. Marcus Vale came in at 1645. He hadn't been invited to this meeting either, but Odom had stopped trying to manage his presence, which Evelyn took as a sign that the lead investigator had made a judgment call about who had earned the right to be in the room. He looked at the signatures. He didn't say anything for a moment. "He flew with those pilots," Marcus said finally. "The ones who might have been in those aircraft if the faults had progressed. They're his people." "Yes," Evelyn said, "I don't—" He stopped. "Tried again. I've spent 14 years keeping aircraft flyable so that pilots come home. That's what I do. Every inspection, every sign-off, every report I write, that's what it's for." He was looking at the signatures and his jaw was set in the way it went when he was working hard at staying level. How does someone sign their name to that? Evelyn didn't have a clean answer for him. She thought about it honestly before she spoke. "They convince themselves the risk is small enough," she said. "And then they convince themselves the risk they already accepted once is the same as accepting it again. Each time is easier because the previous time didn't end badly. Until it does." Marcus was quiet. Then he said, "Pell, the kid who filed the maintenance entry before anyone could tell him not to." "Yes. He's 23 years old. He did the right thing before any of this was clear. Before there was a federal investigation or a IG team or any of it. He shook his head. He just filed the report because it was the right thing to file." "Yes," Evelyn said, "he did. I want to make sure that gets noted somewhere, Marcus said, in whatever comes out of this. I want it noted that he acted on his own. I already put it in my report, Evelyn said, and I'll say it to anyone who asks. Something in Marcus's face settled, not relief exactly, but something. Holloway's formal interview with the Criminal Investigation Unit took place at 1700 in a secured room in the base's legal services building, with his jaggy attorney present, and Evelyn was not there for it. She didn't need to be. What she had built over 4.5 days was in the hands of the people whose job it was to use it, and her job now was to make sure nothing that remained undone got left behind. She spent the late afternoon in the supply room finishing the last sections of her formal technical report, the comprehensive document, not the handoff file, but the one with full technical citations and regulatory references that would form the foundation of the aviation safety findings, separate from the criminal investigation. It was detailed work and slow work, and the light through the window shifted from bright afternoon to amber to the first gray of evening while she did it. She was on the second-to-last section when her phone rang. Not the unlabeled contact this time. A number she recognized as the Aviation Safety Directorate's main coordination line. Ms. Hart, the voice was a man she knew, Director Calder, who ran the ASD program's field operations. He was 60, methodical, and not given to calling in the field unless something required it. I've been briefed on today's developments. Yes, sir. The criminal referral is proceeding through the appropriate channels. The aviation safety findings will be handled separately under our program. A pause. I also spoke with the DoD IG's lead agent this afternoon. She had some things to say about the quality of your documentation. Odom is thorough, Evelyn said. It made the job easier. She said the opposite. She said your documentation made her job easier. Another pause. There's a secondary question I need to address. Your background specifically, the VALKYRIE program designation on your underlying credential. There may be some personnel on the base who have begun to make inferences. Lieutenant Voss asked me a direct question, Evelyn said. I neither confirmed nor denied. She had context from her flight school curriculum. The flight school curriculum was updated after the relevant after-action reports were partially declassified in 2022, Calder said. It's possible that anyone with those training materials could draw conclusions. Yes, sir, that's possible. Is it a problem? Evelyn thought about it. She thought about Kara in the hallway, the way she'd moved differently after the direction she'd chosen. She thought about Marcus and his 18-month-old report in his chest pocket. She thought about Airman Pell, 23 years old, filing a maintenance entry before anyone could tell him not to. No, sir, she said. I don't think it's a problem. A pause. All right. Complete your technical report and transmit it through secure channels by end of business tomorrow. And Ms. Hart, good work. He ended the call. At 1830, Colonel Strake requested a briefing from the IG team on the day's findings. The briefing took place in the Wing Commander's conference room, a room Evelyn had not been in before, and it was attended by Strisk Odom, the JAG officer Briscoe, and, because Strake specifically requested it, Evelyn. She sat at the end of the table. She was the only person in civilian clothes. She was also the only person who had been there from the beginning. Odom laid out the day's findings systematically. The logbook evidence, the pilot validation statements, the DoD circular and the unimplemented modification, the records annex operation, the scope of the falsified certifications across 11 aircraft in 14 months. When Odom finished, Strake was quiet for a long moment. Mercer's status, he said. Formally suspended pending criminal review, Briscoe said. His command authority and flight status are pulled effective immediately. Holloway? Same with the addition of a restriction to base order. The criminal referral to the AFOSI is being processed tonight. Maddox? Under investigation. His involvement appears to be primarily the pressure applied to Lieutenant Voss regarding the aileron issue and the falsified flight log entry in her record. The scope is narrower than Holloway's or Mercer's, but it's not clean. Strake absorbed that. His hands were flat on the table, and he was looking at them in a way that suggested he was making peace with several things simultaneously. The aircraft, he said. The grounded aircraft. What's the path to returning them to service? That's Miss Hart's area, Odom said. Strake looked down the table at Evelyn. It was a different look than the one he'd given her across his desk that morning. That one had been the look of a man recalibrating. This one was something else straightforward, without the weight of what he'd been figuring out. What does it take? He said. 11 aircraft need to go through complete independent inspection and actual test flights before their certifications are valid, Evelyn said. The two 400 series aircraft with the wire routing issue need the 2021 circular modification completed and verified before they fly again. That modification is a 2-day job per aircraft with the right crew. The rest of the certification flights, depending on aircraft availability and crew scheduling, are a 7 to 10-day process if it's prioritized. Can you oversee the inspection protocol? That's my job, she said. He nodded once slowly. Then that's what we're doing. He looked at Odom. Whatever your team needs from the wing, they have it. I mean that without reservation. Understood, Odom said. The meeting ended at 1912. Evelyn walked back to her supply room through the building's empty evening hallways and sat down and looked at the document on her laptop. Finished everything except the final section. She picked up where she'd left off. At 2030, she heard footsteps that she recognized and looked up as Marcus Vale appeared in the doorway. Holloway, he said, what about him? His attorney is pushing back on the record's annex timeline. The JAG told me 20 minutes ago. Holloway's position is that he was performing a routine administrative records review, not destruction of evidence, because the card he removed from the 307's insert board was, and this is his argument, duplicative of a digital record, and therefore not a primary document. Evelyn looked at him. Is there a digital version of that insert board entry? No, that's why the physical card exists. The insert board is for documentation between digital log cycles. There's no digital counterpart. So his argument is factually incorrect. Yes, but his attorney is arguing that Holloway believed it was duplicative when he removed it, which converts the action from deliberate destruction to good faith administrative error. Marcus's jaw was set, which would eliminate the obstruction charge on that specific act. It wouldn't change the other charges, Evelyn said. The falsified certifications, the unimplemented circular, the pilot validation statements. Those don't depend on the insert board. I know, but the insert board is the one thing that puts him physically in contact with evidence destruction personally and contemporaneously. The other charges are documentation-based. This one is, it's the one that shows who he is, not just what the records show. Evelyn thought about that. You witnessed him at the aircraft. I wasn't close enough to identify with certainty that he was the one who opened the panel. I saw two figures in the dark. I know his outline, but a defense attorney will shred that in about 4 minutes. The photo you took of the empty insert board shows an empty panel, doesn't show who emptied it. She looked at the window, at the black outside it. She thought about the flight line at 2100, the cart's headlights pointing away, the pale glow of a radio held up to a face she'd seen clearly, because she'd been close and the light had been specific, and she had the kind of memory that made use of specific light. I was close enough, she said. You were 30 meters away. 22. I paced it the next morning. She paused. And I had a clear line of sight to his profile when he raised the radio. The radio display illuminated his face from below, left side. I've seen that profile across a conference table twice now. I know what it looks like. She looked at Marcus. I'll testify to it. Marcus looked at her for a long moment. They will push hard on that. His attorney will make it about the dark, about the distance, about confirmation bias. Let them push, she said. He was quiet. Then he said, You've testified before. It wasn't quite a question. In different kinds of proceedings, she said. The principle is the same. You say exactly what you saw. No more, no less. You don't dress it up and you don't hedge it. And you don't let someone else's argument change what actually happened. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her, the night he'd handed her the 18-month-old report, like he was still working out the full shape of what he was dealing with. You know, he said, when you first showed up here when I came to see what you were about, that first morning, I thought I was coming to look at someone out of her depth, who'd gotten lucky and found a fault my team should have caught. I was going to figure out what you actually knew and then manage around you. I know, she said. You were right to be skeptical. I wasn't right about anything. He paused. Who are you, actually? And I don't mean the authorization letter. She looked at him for a moment. The question was honest, and the person asking it had earned something real. I'm someone who spent a long time inside the machine, she said, long enough to know where it fails and how it hides the failure. And then I spent a long time figuring out how to fix that from the outside, because from the inside you can't always reach the right places. She paused. I'm also someone who is very tired and has one more section of a technical report to finish before tomorrow. Something in his face did a thing she hadn't seen it do before, softened slightly briefly, in the way of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and just put part of it down. I'll let you work, he said. He was almost out the door when his radio crackled. He stopped and listened. His hand tightened on the doorframe. "What is it?" she said. He turned around slowly. His face had gone back to set to tight, to the controlled expression he wore when something was wrong, and he was working out how wrong. "That was the duty desk," he said. "Aircraft 412. One of the 400 series on your inspection list. The one you haven't inspected yet." He paused. "It's on the flight line." She was already standing. "It's grounded. The base-wide suspension. It's on the flight line with a pilot," Marcus said. "Someone pulled it out of the hangar 20 minutes ago. Flight plan shows a destination off-base classified routing, and the authorization signature on the flight plan is." He looked at her. "Mercer," he said. Evelyn picked up her phone and was already dialing Odom as she crossed the room, because Mercer's flight status had been pulled at 1700. His access to the flight planning system should have been locked simultaneously, and aircraft 412 had the same wire routing fault as the other two, the unimplemented modification, the known failure point in the elevator control wiring, that hadn't been fixed because Holloway had received the circular and buried it, and someone had just put a pilot in it and pointed it at a runway. Odom picked up before the first ring finished. "Aircraft 412 is on the flight line," Evelyn said, already moving through the supply room door into the hallway. 400 series, unimplemented wire routing modification, known control system fault. Someone pulled it from the hangar 20 minutes ago on a flight plan signed by Mercer. His access should have been locked at 1700. A half-second pause. Then Odom's voice went flat and operational. "Where are you?" "Main building, heading to the flight line. Don't touch the aircraft. Don't approach the pilot. I need you to identify who is in that cockpit and call me back." A beep. "I'm mobilizing security forces now." The call ended. Marcus was already ahead of her in the hallway, moving fast with his radio up, and she followed him through the exterior door into the night air that hit cold after the building's warmth. The flight line was lit in pools, the yellow overhead lights of the hangars, the blue edge lighting of the taxiway, and at the north end, the unmistakable shape of an aircraft sitting on the apron, with its cockpit illuminated and its running lights on. They covered the distance in 3 minutes at a pace that was close to running. As they got closer, Evelyn could see the ground crew, just 2 of them, which was below minimum for a standard pre-flight, and the cockpit ladder deployed, and someone in the seat doing checks. From this angle and distance, she couldn't make out the helmet markings. Marcus keyed his radio. "This is Vale. Who authorized the ground crew on 412? "Static. Then Chief, the authorization came through Ops. Signed out at 1950. Who signed it?" A pause. "Captain Mercer's credentials." "Mercer's credentials are suspended. Did anyone verify against the suspension list?" Another pause, longer. "I, Chief, that list was updated at 1700. The ground crew reported at 1930. I don't know if the updated list was "Find out," Marcus said, and dropped the radio. He looked at Evelyn. His credentials were in the system. Someone either didn't check, or the update didn't propagate in time. Or someone checked and decided not to ask questions, she said. They were 30 meters from the aircraft now. Close enough that the cockpit light resolved into the specific glow of an instrument panel on pre-flight sequence, and the figure in the seat was moving through checks with practiced speed faster than standard, the speed of someone who knows they're on borrowed time. Evelyn looked at the helmet. The markings on the side were Mercer's. She'd seen them on the flight line 4 days ago when he'd been standing beside his aircraft, telling her she belonged in the gift shop. "It's him," she said. She called Odom. "Mercer is in the cockpit. He's in pre-flight. He's moving fast. Security forces are 90 seconds out. The tower has been notified they will not issue takeoff clearance. He cannot legally depart. He knows that," Evelyn said. "He's going anyway. Because the tower could refuse clearance, and Mercer could still taxi to the runway and push the throttle forward, and at that point the only things stopping him were physical barriers, or a pilot who chose to stop. And a man who had already decided that self-preservation mattered more than the people around him was not a man who was going to stop himself." She looked at the aircraft. At the wire routing fault she'd documented 48 hours ago in the dark with a flashlight. At the elevator control wiring that hadn't been modified per the 2021 circular, the failure point that lived in the gap between 2 support clips where the insulation had worn through, and 2 conductors sat close enough together that under vibration they could contact. High G maneuvering, that was the failure condition. Sustained high G load in the elevator control system. Or, she thought, a hard takeoff roll with full throttle on a heavy airframe. "Marcus," she said, "if he applies full afterburner on takeoff roll, What's the vibration profile on the 400 series elevator system? Marcus understood the question immediately. High. It's a known resonance issue at that power setting. There's a power reduction protocol for the first 30 seconds of roll, specifically because of the vibration loading on the tail section. He paused. The modification in the circular was partly designed to fix that resonance issue. If the conductor's contact during full power takeoff roll, elevator control loss, Marcus said, on the ground at speed with no altitude to recover. She was already moving toward the aircraft. Evelyn. Marcus grabbed her arm. Not hard, just enough to stop her forward momentum. Security forces are 90 seconds. He'll be on the runway in 60, she said. And if those wires contact at rotation speed, he dies on the tarmac. She looked at him. He looked at her. His hand dropped. She went fast, not running at an angle, but straight at the aircraft's nose, into the pool of light from the cockpit instruments, visible and deliberate. The ground crew scrambled back. One of them shouted something she didn't catch. She went to the base of the ladder and started up. Mercer saw her when she was 4 rungs up. Through the canopy glass, his face registered her presence, and she watched him do a rapid calculation, one she recognized because she'd seen it before in people who were running out of road. The calculation of whether what was in front of them changed what they'd already decided. He reached for the canopy control. She was faster. She had the canopy rail in her hand before it sealed, and she held it, not pulling against the mechanism. Just present, just weight and grip, the particular message of someone who was not moving. Mercer, her voice was level. Not loud, she was close enough that she didn't need loud. The wire routing on the elevator control system. I documented it 2 nights ago. It wasn't modified per the 2021 circular. You go to full afterburner on the takeoff roll, there's a conductor contact risk in the tail section that ends this on the runway. He stared at her through the glass. His jaw was set, and his hands were on the throttle, and the instrument panel in front of him was alive with pre-flight completion indicators. Get off my aircraft, he said. His voice was tight, controlled barely. I'm not on your aircraft, she said. I'm on the ladder, and I'm going to stay here.
You don't.
I know the fault. I documented it. If you fly this aircraft tonight the way you're planning to fly it, you may not land. She held his eyes. I'm not trying to stop you because of the investigation. I'm telling you this because I know what the fault does, and you deserve to know before you make the decision. Something moved in his face. Not much. He was a man who had spent the better part of a week being angry at her, and anger is an efficient fuel. It burns clean and leaves very little room for other things. But she watched him, hear her. The specific, involuntary change in a person's expression when information lands in them against their intention. The wires, he said. Elevator control. 2 conductors, insulation worn through. Close enough to contact under vibration loading at high power settings. I photographed it. I have the location references. You can verify it yourself right now if you have a flashlight and 40 seconds. Behind her, she heard the security forces' vehicles, the specific sound of tires on tarmac and then doors. She didn't look back. If you've been lying, Mercer said. His voice had gone lower. I haven't lied to you about anything, she said. Not once, including right now. The aircraft's engines were at idle. The instrument panel was green across the board because the pre-flight system couldn't detect a physical wire wear fault that required eyes and a flashlight in the right location, which was exactly how it had been missed for over a year. Mercer looked at her for 3 more seconds. Then he reached forward and began the engine shutdown sequence. She stepped down 2 rungs and gave the canopy room, and he pushed it open. The night air came into the cockpit, and he sat there for a moment in the sudden quiet of a spooling down engine, with his still on and his hands in his lap. The security forces reached the aircraft. She stepped down the rest of the ladder and moved to the side and let them do what they'd come to do, and she stood in the apron light and watched Cole Mercer climb down his own ladder, for what she understood was likely the last time. And she did not feel triumphant about it, because triumph wasn't what she felt when someone who had done real harm finally ran out of road. What she felt was tired and clear, the way you feel after a long effort when the outcome was the right one, and the cost was the real cost, and you don't pretend otherwise. Marcus appeared beside her. Was that true? About the takeoff roll? Yes, she said. He was quiet for a moment. You could have let him go. No, she said. I couldn't. He didn't argue with that. The rest of that night moved in the particular rhythm of a situation that has broken open and is now being managed rather than fought. Mercer was taken into custody with the added charge of unauthorized use of a restricted military aircraft while under a formal suspension order. The ground crew who had prepped the aircraft were interviewed and cleared. The system update lag had been genuine, not complicity. and they had followed the authorization they'd been given in good faith. The tower operators who had been preparing to deny clearance were debriefed, and their logs entered into evidence. Evelyn went back to her supply room at 2230 and finished the last section of her technical report. She finished it at 43, read it through once from the beginning, made 3 small corrections, and transmitted it through the secure channel Calder had designated. Then she sat back in her chair and looked at the buzzing overhead light and the metal table and the stacks of documents that had been the architecture of the last 5 days, and she allowed herself, for approximately 4 minutes, to just sit. It wasn't peace exactly. It was more like the absence of the specific pressure that had been on her since the first morning, the weight of knowing and not yet being able to make it matter. That weight was gone now. What remained was the ordinary weight of everything else, which was considerable but manageable. She packed her bag. The formal proceedings moved at the pace that federal investigations move, which is to say both faster and slower than anyone involved found comfortable. By the end of the first week following the IG team's arrival, the criminal referral for Holloway had been processed through the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, with charges that included falsification of official military records, failure to implement a mandatory airworthiness directive with documented knowledge of the safety risk, destruction of evidence, and obstruction of a federal investigation. The charges were serious enough that his JAG attorney stopped talking about good faith administrative error and started talking about cooperation. Mercer faced charges of falsification of official records for the pilot validation statements, unauthorized operation of a restricted military asset, and conduct unbecoming. His attorney entered a not guilty plea on all counts, which was his right, and which the evidence would address in time. Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Maddox Kara's flight instructor received non-judicial punishment for the pressure he'd applied to her, and for his role in the falsified log entry bearing her name. It was less than what Holloway and Mercer faced, which was accurate to the difference in what he'd done, and it still ended his career progression and his command aspirations, which he had understood, was coming from the moment Odom's team had walked through the door. Airman First Class Derek Pell, 23 years old, received a formal letter of commendation from the DoD Inspector General's office for his initiative in documenting the aileron repair before the investigation began. Marcus Vale made sure the letter was read aloud at a squadron formation. He didn't ask permission to do it. He just did it. Evelyn stayed at Red Mesa for 17 more days after the investigation went active. She stayed because the inspection protocol was her design and she intended to see it through, because the work she'd started needed to be finished and finished correctly, and because she had told Colonel Strake she would oversee it, and she did not say things she didn't mean. The inspection of the 11 grounded aircraft took 9 days with the full maintenance crew working prioritized schedules. She walked every one of them herself, independent of the crew's findings, cross-checking, and on 2 occasions finding additional items that needed attention, minor things, nothing with the urgency of the wire faults or the aileron repair, but things that needed to be on the record and fixed before the aircraft flew again. The 400 series wire routing modification took 11 days for the 2 affected aircraft, slightly longer than her original estimate, because one of the aircraft had a secondary issue in the same area that was identified during the modification work and had to be properly addressed before the modification was complete. She approved the additional time without hesitation. The test flights for the certification program happened over the last 7 days. She was on the flight line for every one of them, not because she needed to be, but because she had grounded those aircraft, and she wanted to see them clear. She stood in the morning desert light and watched them go up one by one, and each time one came back and the pilot's report came back clean, she wrote it into the certification log in her own hand. On the 14th day, Caravas flew one of the cleared aircraft. A training flight, standard duration, nothing extraordinary. She came back, taxied in, shut down, and climbed down the ladder. She looked across the flight line and found Evelyn standing near the hangar, and she held up one hand, not a wave exactly, more of a salute that didn't quite commit to being a salute, and Evelyn returned it. It was a small moment. It mattered the way small moments do when they're built on something real. On the morning of her last day, Evelyn walked the flight line one more time, not with a clipboard or an inspection kit, just walking in the early light before the heat built, the way she had walked it the first morning when everyone had been laughing. The flight line looked like a flight line. Aircraft in their proper bays, maintenance crews moving through the morning routine, the sound of equipment and voices, and the distant whine of a ground power unit running diagnostics. It looked ordinary, that was the point. She stopped at the spot where she'd first been dismissed the apron near Hangar 7, where Mercer had made his gift shop joke, and the laughter had spread down the line like a current. The concrete was the same. The overhead lights were the same. The mountains in the west were doing what they did every morning in the desert, going from black to purple to the color of something being decided. She stood there for a moment. There are things that people who do work like hers understand that are hard to explain to people who don't. One of them is that the work is rarely about the moment of recognition. The moment exists the signed letter, the cleared aircraft, the person in authority who shakes your hand differently than they would have a week ago. But the work itself doesn't live in that moment. The work lives in the 5 days before it. In the supply room floor and the stale granola bar and the conversation with Kara in the hallway. And Marcus's hand reaching into his chest pocket for a report he'd been carrying for 18 months. In Airman Pell, at 23 years old, filing a finding before anyone could tell him the cost of it. The work is everything that happens before the recognition. The recognition is just confirmation that it mattered. She already knew it mattered. She'd known it when the 307 landed cleanly on a pilot who hadn't died, and when the 412's engine spooled down in the dark before a wire fault turned a takeoff roll into something that couldn't be taken back. Marcus Vale was waiting at the edge of the apron, near the parking area where her transport was scheduled. He had his cover on and his hands in his pockets, and he looked like a man who had thought about what he wanted to say, and was still not sure he had it right. She stopped in front of him. Pell got a transfer request approved, he said. Advanced Maintenance Training Program. Competitive. He applied 3 months ago, and it came through yesterday. Good, she said. He'll be good at it, I told him that. Marcus looked at the mountains briefly. I owe you something I'm not going to say right, but I'm going to try. You don't owe me anything. Let me try, he said. She waited. When you got here, I thought you were a problem to be managed. I thought the system would handle you, not because I believed the system was right, but because that's what the system does, and I'd learned to live inside that. I'd filed my report 18 months ago, and it went nowhere, and I told myself I'd done my part. He stopped, started again. What you did wasn't just find the faults. You made it so that looking away was harder than looking. And that's, he paused. I don't know how to thank someone for that, but I wanted to try. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about what he'd said. Looking away was harder than looking. And she thought it was probably the most description of what she actually did that anyone had ever given her. You didn't look away, she said. When it came to the point, you didn't. That matters more than the 18 months before it. I could have looked away a dozen times in the last 5 days. But you didn't, she said. He was quiet. Then, roughly, you going to be back this way? The inspection protocol stays in place for 90 days. I'll have a follow-up review at the 60-day mark. She paused. I'll be back. Something in his face settled. He extended his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm and real and carried the specific weight of someone who meant it. She picked up her bag. The transport vehicle pulled out of Red Mesa Tactical Air Station at 712 on a Thursday morning. Evelyn sat in the back with her encrypted drive and her bag, and the specific tiredness of someone who has been on a long job and is now in the gap between the end of it and whatever comes next. The desert moved past the windows, the hard, flat color of it, the scrub and the dust and the mountains that went on longer than you expected when you were moving through them on the ground. She had 4 messages on her phone. One from Calder, the report had been received, and the findings were being processed. One from Odom, the formal evidence package, had been submitted to the AFOSI, and the case was proceeding. One from the unlabeled contact, 2 words, well done. And one from a number she didn't immediately recognize, with an Arizona area code. She opened it. This is Kara Voss. I got your contact through Chief Vale. I hope that's okay. I wanted to say something I didn't say well enough when you were here. The thing you did coming back for the 412. Staying on that ladder. That's the thing I'm going to remember. Not because it was dramatic, because it would have been easier not to. And you did it anyway. I want to be that kind of pilot, thank you. Evelyn read it twice. Then she looked out the window at the desert. There is a particular kind of quiet that comes after the right kind of hard work, and it doesn't feel like peace. It's not soft enough for that. It feels more like ground, like something solid under your feet that was always going to be there, and the only question was whether you were going to stand on it or not. She had spent 11 years as a combat aviator and 4 years as a field evaluator, and she had been dismissed in supply rooms and mocked on flight lines and handed the wrong chair in the wrong part of the building, and every time she had done the same thing, she had gone back to work. Not because it was easy, and not because it didn't cost anything, and not because the people around her made it simple. She had gone back to work because the work mattered, and because the people inside those aircraft, the ones who didn't know yet whether the machine they trusted was going to hold, mattered, and because someone had to be the person who looked at the right thing first. She typed back, "You already are, EH." She put the phone in her bag. 3 weeks after Evelyn left Red Mesa, the Air Force Office of Special Investigations formally charged Major Grant Holloway with 4 criminal counts. The charging document named each violation with the flat, procedural language of federal indictments, which does not dramatize and does not editorialize and does not need to, because the facts it contains are sufficient. His JAG attorney entered a formal cooperation agreement on the second count, the failure to implement the airworthiness directive, in exchange for a sentencing recommendation on the others. The cooperation was accepted. The agreement was not a mercy. It was a mechanism for ensuring the full picture came out, including everything Holloway knew about how the falsification program had been structured, who had participated, and how long it had been running. Captain Cole Mercer went to a formal military court, proceeding 61 days after the investigation opened. He pleaded not guilty on the falsification charges and guilty on the unauthorized aircraft operation, which his attorney had calculated was the better exchange. The court didn't accept the division cleanly. The pilot validation statements were entered into evidence in full, with Mercer's signature on each one, and the prosecutor walked the court through each aircraft on the list, each certification date, and what the actual condition of each aircraft had been at the time. Mercer had signed his name to a document saying he had personally confirmed it airworthy. His flight status was revoked. His command career ended. He left the military with a record that said, in the specific language those records use, exactly what he had done and what it had cost. Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Maddox retired early, which the Air Force accepted, and which he understood was the specific shape of the grace he was being given, and he took it without argument. He wrote a letter to Kara Voss through the formal channels, acknowledging what he had done and what it had cost her. The letter was 4 paragraphs long. She read it twice and put it in a drawer and went back to work. At the 60-day mark, Evelyn returned to Red Mesa for the follow-up inspection review. She arrived in the same transport vehicle, pulled up to the same gate, showed her credentials to the same checkpoint that had waived her through 5 days into the investigation, when Odom's team had established the access restoration. The airman at the gate was not the same airman who had been there on her first day, but she hadn't expected him to be. She drove past Hangar 7. There was no one on the apron to watch her pass. There was a maintenance crew working on an aircraft near the hangar bay entrance. 3 of them crouched at the nose gear with equipment spread around them on a ground cloth, doing the careful and ordinary work of keeping machines flyable. One of them looked up as the vehicle passed. It was Airman Pell. He was too far away to read his expression clearly, and she was past him in 3 seconds. But in those 3 seconds, he lifted his hand in the same half-salute, half-wave that Kara had given her from the flight line, and she raised hers in return through the vehicle's window. The 60-day review took 2 days. The inspection protocols she had designed were being followed. The maintenance logs were clean, genuinely clean, the kind of clean that takes real work to maintain, which was a different thing entirely from the kind that takes falsification. The 2 400 series aircraft with the wire routing modification were flying without incident. All 11 aircraft were current on their certifications, with test flights properly documented and flight hours properly logged. Marcus Vale ran the review briefing. He had notes and he had data, and he presented both without ceremony, and when he was done, he looked at her across the table and said, "Anything you need to see in person?" "Show me the 412, she said. He walked her to it himself. It was in its bay, clean and properly stored, with its maintenance log current and its next scheduled inspection properly dated. It looked like what it was, an aircraft that was being taken care of correctly, by people who understood why that mattered. She ran her hand along the fuselage near the tail section, not checking anything specific, just the old habit of touching the thing you're responsible for. The one that comes from years of learning, that machines have a texture that tells you things if you're paying attention. The metal was warm from the morning sun. She stepped back. "It's good," she said. Marcus nodded. Something in the set of his shoulders was different from the first time she'd met him, not looser exactly, but less like a man holding himself together against pressure that was always there. Like the pressure had changed. "The new maintenance officer came in last week," he said. "Transferred from Kessler. She's thorough. Have you worked with her yet?" 3 days. She found a consumable discrepancy in the 300 series logs on her second day. He paused. I was the one who flagged it. She caught it because I flagged it. How did that feel? He thought about it. Like it was supposed to, he said. She left Red Mesa for the second time on a Friday afternoon, with the review complete and the findings entered and the follow-up schedule set. This time the departure was quiet or no transport, just a rental car, because Calder's office had stopped formalizing her logistics once the investigation closed, and she was back on standard program protocol. She drove west into the desert, toward the regional airport, an hour and a half away. The mountains came up on her left as the road climbed out of the valley, and the light was doing the thing it does in the desert at 4 in the afternoon in early fall, going golden and specific, the kind of light that makes ordinary things look like they were meant to be seen. She drove with the window down, because the temperature was right for it, and because after 17 days in a supply room with a buzzing overhead light, she had developed a specific appreciation for the absence of ceilings. She thought about Kara, who had a training syllabus advancement review in 3 weeks, and who had, according to the base's flight scheduling system that Evelyn had seen during the review, logged more hours in the last 60 days than any other lieutenant in the squadron. Not because she was trying to prove something, because she was a pilot, and that was what pilots did when the machine they were flying was finally what it was supposed to be. She thought about Marcus, who had carried a report in his chest pocket for 18 months and had given it to the right person at the right moment, and who was now running a maintenance organization that had a new officer who flagged discrepancies on her second day because the chief who worked for her was someone who expected discrepancies to be flagged. She thought about Pell at 23, who had filed the finding before anyone told him to, who was now in an advanced training program that would put him in front of more aircraft and more consequential decisions, and who would probably handle them the same way he'd handled this one. Because that's not usually something that changes in a person. It's usually something they either have or they don't. She thought about the people she didn't know. The pilots who had flown the aircraft on the fraudulent certifications without knowing the certifications were fraudulent, who had climbed into machines that someone had signed off on as safe without doing the work to make them safe, and who had landed most of them, all of them so far, not because the system had protected them, but because the faults hadn't progressed far enough yet when they flew. The margin between what happened and what could have happened was not a comfortable number to sit with, and she didn't try to make it comfortable. That discomfort was part of why the work mattered. Here is what she understood about the work after 11 years in the air and 4 years on the ground. Examining the places where the systems failed, the failures almost never happened all at once. They accumulated. They were made of small decisions by people who told themselves the risk was manageable, and then made the same small decision again, and the accumulation grew in the space between what was true and what the paperwork said was true, and it stayed there until someone looked at the right thing first. The someone doing the looking was rarely celebrated ahead of time. They were usually dismissed or managed or handed the chair with the short leg in the supply room off the maintenance bay. They were usually the person in the room who was easiest to move because they didn't have rank or tenure or the specific social weight that comes from being the kind of person everyone already agreed mattered, and then they did the work anyway. Not because it was without cost. Not because it was simple or safe or rewarded immediately. Because the people in the aircraft deserved someone looking, and because a signature on a false document had consequences that propagated forward in time until someone stopped them, and because the work, the real work, the actual looking and the documenting, and the standing on the ladder in the dark, telling the truth to someone who might not want to hear it, that work was the thing that mattered. She had been dismissed 4 days ago, and 4 years ago, and 11 years before that. She had been handed inadequate rooms and restricted access, and the specific condescension of people who looked at her credentials and decided those credentials meant something smaller than they did. She had walked out of all of it carrying the same thing she'd walked in with. The road descended out of the mountains, and the valley opened up ahead, and somewhere in the middle distance, the regional airport's lights were coming on in the early dusk, and the sky above the western horizon was doing all the things desert skies do when no one has told them to be modest about it. She reached over and turned on the radio. Something low and familiar came through the speaker, and she left it. She had a flight in 2 hours. After that, a debrief at the directorate. After that, a new assignment that Calder had mentioned in his last message, another base, another installation, another set of records that didn't quite add up. The kind of place where someone needed to be the person who looked at the right thing first. She kept driving. The mountains went purple behind her. The lights ahead came up through the gathering dark. And Evelyn Hart, evaluator, aviator, the woman they had called a nurse on a flight line in the Arizona desert on a Monday morning when they thought dismissal was free, drove toward the next thing, carrying exactly what she had always carried, the knowledge that the work mattered, the willingness to do it anyway, and the particular, unshakable quiet of someone who has never needed anyone's permission to be exactly who she was. That is not a power that can be suspended pending review. That is not a clearance that can be revoked. That is the only kind of authority that cannot be taken, because it was never given. It was built slowly in supply rooms and on flight lines and in the dark with a flashlight in 40 seconds, and it belonged to her completely, and she carried it west into the last light of the day, like something she had earned and intended to keep.